The hospital was quiet, desert quiet, the kind of silence that sits heavy in the middle of the afternoon when the heat outside bakes the walls and nobody expects anything to happen. Then the front doors blew open. 12 men in black, faces covered, moving fast and organized through a military hospital that had no idea what was coming. Doctors froze. Nurses dropped to the floor. Someone screamed, "Get the Americans out of here." 2 Navy SEALs in desert camouflage rushed the corridor. Weapons up, training taking over. They lasted 40 seconds. The terrorists were ready for SEALs, but nobody warned them about the nurse because while every doctor was hiding and every soldier was falling back, the new American nurse walked calmly into a service corridor alone, a single shot cracked through the desert air. 1 terrorist dropped. Clean. No panic, no warning, just precision. Another moved. Another shot. Then silence spread through the corridor, and that's when the remaining terrorists realized something was very wrong. They hadn't stormed a hospital. They'd walked straight into her kill zone. Before we begin, hit subscribe and drop sniper in the comments. By the end of the story, that word is going to mean something you did not expect when you walked in here today. Al-Rashid Military Medical Center sat in the middle of Baghdad like a building that had decided to take itself seriously. Solid concrete walls, wide corridors, equipment that would not have looked out of place in any major American hospital. The Iraqi military had built it well and maintained it carefully, and on a normal afternoon, it ran with the specific quiet efficiency of a facility that knew its purpose and got on with it. The desert outside pressed against every window with its flat, pale light and its heat that made the air above the roads ripple like water. Inside, the air conditioning kept everything at a temperature that made the heat outside feel like a different planet. It was the kind of building that felt safe. The kind of building where people came to get better. That afternoon, 9 American medical volunteers, 4 doctors, and 5 nurses were 3 weeks into a 6-month posting doing the work they had come a long way to do and thinking about dinner. Ava was changing a dressing in room 4 when most of her colleagues were in the break room arguing about whether the rice from the hospital canteen was better than the previous week or worse. She was the quietest of the 5 nurses. Not unfriendly, just contained. The kind of person who listened more than she talked and noticed more than she mentioned. The other nurses liked her. The doctors found her slightly puzzling in the way that competent people sometimes puzzle people who expect less from them. She had volunteered for the specific posting at the specific hospital at this specific time and had not explained why beyond saying she wanted the experience. Nobody had pushed. She was good at her job. She showed up early. She stayed late and in 3 weeks she had already memorized every corridor in the building, including 2 that most of the permanent staff used as shortcuts and 1 that almost nobody used at all. 3 Navy SEALs had been at Al-Rashid for 48 hours. They were not there for the American medical team or for any official training exercise. They were there for 1 patient, a senior Iraqi government minister named Karim, who had undergone emergency cardiac surgery 2 days earlier and whose presence in this building was known to the right people and unknown to everyone else. The SEALs were in desert camouflage and they moved through the hospital with the specific professional courtesy of people who understood they were guests in a medical space and behaved accordingly. Their names were Holt, Torres, and Webb. Hull was the senior, late 30s, steady, the kind of man who assessed every room he entered in under 5 seconds, and remembered what he found. Torres and Webb were younger and very good. All 3 of them had noticed Ava in passing. Hull had mentioned to Torres that she moved differently from the other nurses. Torres had shrugged. Webb had watched her change a dressing once and said nothing, but filed what he saw somewhere he would remember. The afternoon was at its quietest point. That slow stretch between 2 and 3 when the post-lunch LOL settles into a building, and the pace drops and people move at 3/4 speed without entirely meaning to. Ava finished the dressing in room 4 and stood up straight and looked at the window. The desert outside was doing what the desert always did at this hour, sitting flat and pale and entirely still under a sky that had gone white with heat. She stood at the window for a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes moved to the eastern approach road. A dust cloud. 3 vehicles moving fast. No markings on any of them. She watched for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned away from the window, walked to the door of room 4, and locked it from the inside. The patient in the bed looked at her with mild confusion. She smiled at him. "Stay here," she said quietly. He nodded. He did not know why, but something in the way she said it made the question feel unnecessary. She was in the service corridor behind the medication station when the front doors blew open. The sound of it traveled through the building, the way sounds travel in large concrete structures, fast and everywhere at once, bouncing off walls and floors and ceilings until it seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Then the shouting started, then the first shot, then the second. Ava moved through the service corridor without running. Not because she was not urgent, but because running in an unfamiliar space in a crisis costs time and composure, and she could not afford either loss. She moved the way water moves through a channel, fast directed, completely without waste. The corridor was dim, and she kept one hand on the wall and counted her steps from memory. 12 steps to the junction, left 4 steps to the maintenance door. She had walked this route 17 times in 3 weeks for no reason she had ever explained to anyone. Outside in the main corridor, Torres and Webb had pushed into position outside Minister Kareem's room on the 2nd floor. They were good and they were fast, and they engaged immediately with the discipline of men who had trained for exactly this kind of situation. They took down 4 terrorists in the first 30 seconds. Then the numbers and the angles and the fact that the terrorists had clearly studied the building layout worked against them in the specific way that preparation always eventually overcomes reaction. Torres went down with a leg wound that was serious and definitive. Webb took a hit to the shoulder and hit the wall hard and stayed down. Both of them alive, neither of them able to continue. 4 terrorists down on the corridor floor. 8 still moving through the building with the organized confidence of people who believe the hardest part of their afternoon was already behind them. Holt heard the engagement end from the stairwell and moved toward it and found his 2 people down and the math very clearly against him and a building full of doctors and nurses and one very important patient and nobody else standing between any of them and what was coming next. He heard a sound behind him and spun. Weapon up. Finger on the trigger, and found Ava standing at the end of the corridor in her light blue scrubs with her hands visible at her sides looking at the barrel of his weapon with an expression that contained no fear and no surprise, just the specific calm assessment of someone measuring whether the immediate situation requires a change of plan. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "Put that down. Cover the stairwell and do not let anyone past you until I tell you otherwise." Holt stared at her. She was a nurse. She was in scrubs. There were 8 armed terrorists in this building. And she was telling him to cover the stairwell like she was assigning him a task she had already thought through completely. And the part that stopped him from arguing, the part that made him step back toward the stairwell without fully deciding to, was that she was already gone before he finished processing what she had said. Hull had been a Navy SEAL for 14 years. He had operated in places that did not appear on standard maps, made decisions in fractions of seconds that determined whether people lived or did not, and worked alongside some of the most capable people the American military had ever produced. He knew what competence looked like. He knew what it felt like to be in a room with someone who had moved past training into something older and more reliable. The specific quality of a person who had been tested so many times in so many places that their response to danger had stopped being a decision and become simply a reflex. He had recognized that quality in Torres on their 3rd mission together. He had recognized it in Webb 6 months after that. Standing at the stairwell with his weapon up and the sound of the building settling around the violence that had just happened to his team, he found himself thinking about a nurse in light blue scrubs who had looked at the barrel of his gun and told him what to do. And the thing that bothered him most was not that she had done it. It was that she had been right. The service corridor Ava had disappeared into was not on the visitor map of Al Rashid Military Medical Center. It was not on the staff orientation materials either. It existed in the building the way certain things exist in old structures, practically quietly known to the people who maintained the pipes and the wiring and not particularly relevant to anyone else. Ava had found it on day 4 of her posting. Walking the building after her shift in the specific methodical way she walked every new building she entered. Starting at the top and working down, learning exits and angles and the kind of spatial information that most people never think to collect because most people have never needed it the way she had needed it. The corridor connected the ground floor medication station to a maintenance stairwell that ran uninterrupted from the basement to the roof. She had walked it 17 times. She knew exactly how long it took, exactly where it turned, and exactly where it came out. On the 2nd floor, a terrorist moved through the ward with his weapon tracking beds and doorways in the specific sweep of someone who had been trained to clear rooms and was doing it with the mechanical confidence of a man who believed the building was his. Now, he was wrong. He was wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they have correctly assessed every visible threat in an environment, and have not considered the possibility of a threat they cannot see. Ava came out of the maintenance stairwell door behind him at a distance of 12 m. 1 shot. He was down before the sound finished traveling down the corridor. She moved to his position in 4 seconds, took what she needed from him, and was back in the stairwell before anyone on his team had processed the silence where his radio check should have been. Holt heard the shot from the stairwell. Single, clean, no return fire. He pressed against the wall and kept his eyes on the corridor below him and tried to count what he knew. 2 of his people were down behind him. Torres, breathing hard, Webb unconscious, but stable against the wall. 8 terrorists in the building 30 seconds ago. Now the radio in his earpiece crackled once through the jamming. Just enough signal to carry 2 words in a voice that was completely level. 2 down. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, then back at the stairwell. The mathematics of the situation had just changed, and the variable that changed it was a blonde American nurse who had been in this country for 3 weeks and had walked into a maintenance corridor alone and come out of it having improved the odds by 1. He thought about the way she had looked at his weapon. He thought about the way she had moved. He updated several things he thought he understood and covered the stairwell. Outside the ward on the ground floor, 2 doctors and 3 nurses were behind a locked supply room door. One of the doctors, a man named Patterson, who had been a surgeon for 22 years and had operated in emergency rooms in 4 countries and considered himself a person of reasonable courage, was sitting on the floor with his back against a shelf of 4 bags and his hands pressed flat on his knees to stop them shaking. He was not ashamed of the shaking. He was aware that the shaking meant he was human, and that being human in a room full of locked doors and distant gunfire was an entirely appropriate response. What he could not stop thinking about was Ava. He had last seen her in room 4 at the start of the shift. Room 4 was not a locked supply room. Ava was not behind a locked door. He did not know where she was. And the not knowing sat in his chest like a stone. If you have ever watched someone walk towards something that everyone else was running away from, drop courage in the comments, because what Ava did in that building was not something most people are built for. And she did it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The terrorists regrouped in the east corridor on the 2nd floor. The 4 remaining from the upper team pulling back to assess after losing 2 men to shots that had come from directions that did not make tactical sense to them. Their leader was a careful man and he was recalculating. His plan had accounted for the SEALs. His intelligence had described the building, the staff, the rotations, and the response capability with the thoroughness of preparation that comes from people who take their work seriously. Nowhere in that intelligence was there a description of what was currently happening to his team. He spoke quietly into his radio and pulled his remaining people into a tighter formation and made a decision that seemed logical given the information available to him. Push harder, move faster, reach the target before whatever was picking off his men could reposition. It was a reasonable decision. It was also the last significant mistake he made that afternoon. Holt's radio crackled again, stronger this time, the jamming signal fluctuating for just long enough to carry a full sentence. Ava's voice, still level, still carrying that specific quality of calm that belonged to someone running on something more reliable than adrenaline. 3 down, 5 left, 2 going to the basement, 3 coming to the 2nd floor corridor in approximately 90 seconds. Holt processed this in the time it took to breathe once. He looked at Torres against the wall. Torres, who had heard the radio and was looking back at him with the expression of a man who was putting pieces together despite a serious leg wound and did not entirely like the picture they were forming. Holt set his position at the stairwell top. 90 seconds. He could work with 90 seconds. 4 down, Ava's voice said through the static. And somewhere in the basement, 2 terrorists who had gone to destroy the communication system were about to discover that the most dangerous person in Al-Rashid Military Medical Center was already between them and the door. The basement of Al-Rashid Military Medical Center was not a place most of the medical staff thought about very much. It existed below the building the way basement exists in large institutions. Functional, unglamorous, full of the infrastructure that kept everything above it running without anyone upstairs needing to think about how. Generators, water systems, the communications hub that connected the hospital to the outside world. The one the 2 terrorists had been sent to destroy specifically because cutting it permanently would extend the window before any coordinated response could reach the building. They came down the basement stairs confident and fast, weapons up. The specific momentum of people executing a plan that was still largely on schedule despite the unexplained losses above them. The basement corridor was narrow and lit by fluorescent strips that buzzed slightly in the heat. They moved through it in a tight stack the way they had been trained to. Move. First man tracking left, second man tracking right. The professional geometry of a 2-person clearance. They reached the communications room door. The first man raised his boot to kick it open and then he stopped because the door was already open and the room beyond it was empty, and somewhere behind them in the basement corridor a sound that should not have been there was not there anymore either. Ava stepped out from the utility alcove beside the generator housing, and the basement was quiet in a new way before either of them fully understood what had happened. She had come down the maintenance stairwell ahead of them, not racing, not guessing, moving on the specific foreknowledge of someone who had listened to their radio traffic through the terrorists' own equipment and understood their plan before they reached the bottom step. She had 3 seconds of position advantage. And she used all 3 of them the way she used everything, completely and without waste. When it was over, she stood in the basement corridor and checked herself the way she had been trained to check herself after a close engagement, methodically, starting at the head and moving down. The cut on her forearm was from a knife that had gotten closer than it should have. A tactical knife worn by the second man, whose training had been better than his partner's, and who had reacted faster than the situation had given him room to recover from. She looked at the cut for 1 second, pressed the sleeve of her scrub top against it, moved to the communications.